All right, so let's try to get a window on screen. So the function to create a window is not surprisingly called CreateWindow. Again, going to Google, CreateWindow, copying in the function prototype. Our job now is just to fill out all these parameters to the CreateWindow function so that they're valid and create the type of window that we're interested in. Again, first is the return value. Set that up. Next parameter is the class name. And the window class associated with Windows is a little complicated. We have to actually create one ourselves with RegisterClass. For now, we're going to just assume we did that and made a Windows class variable and pass it in. Next is the window name. Window name is what shows up in the caption. Again, for the back of a better name, I'm just going to call it AAA game. Next is the window style. And these are actually, we have to choose a good one. This determines what type of window it is. It's going to be a tooltip or an edit box or a main application window. Main application window is called, you use the style WS overlapped window, which is a combination of a bunch of flags that make you, get you a main application, the features of a main application window. Also, we're going to go ahead and add in WS visible. In some applications, you might pay attention to this fourth parameter of WinMain, the command show, and that determines if you should start your window as visible or minimize or maximize or whatever. We're a video game, so pretty much inevitably we're going to just open in full screen and take over the entire computer. We'll just start by making it always visible so we don't have to worry about it. The next four parameters are the coordinates and size of the window. Fortunately, there's a constant CWUseDefault, which specifies to Windows that it can do whatever you want to be default. And it'll do some nice things like put it on the primary monitor, not overlap exactly the previously made window, etc. to be a pretty good set of defaults. Next is the parent, and since we're the main window, we don't really have a parent, so we'll put a null. Next is a menu, and we don't have a menu yet, so we'll again put a null, it'll be just fine. Next is the instance, the module handle, which is passed in WinMain, so we can just specify it like that and pass it in. And the final is a parameter that gets passed along to the WM create message that gets made when the window gets created, and again we'll pass in null because we don't really need that set up. All right, so we've got reasonable parameters to create window except for this win class. Going back to the documentation, it says it's a atom created by the RegisterClassEx class function, which has been deprecated. And they ask you to use the RegisterClassEx function, so we'll go ahead and call the RegisterClassEx function, and it will return a wind class atom, and it takes a wind class X structure, which we'll go ahead and define one, and pass in the pointer to the RegisterClassEx function. All right, so in theory, if we filled out this WinClassEx structure with valid parameters, this will register that class and return an atom, which we can then pass to CreateWindow. A little bit of confusion here is the CreateWindow first parameter is actually a string pointer, but we have an atom pointer, and it says right down here that if you use an atom, you must put the bits of the atom in the low order word of this pointer, and a convenient way to do that is just cast it directly to a string pointer, and that will work just fine and get the atom bits, the bits of this variable into the right place in the CreateWindow parameter. All right, so now all we have left to do is fill out this structure with reasonable stuff. this structure passing style is pretty common in Windows. It allows this function to be changed, and the number of parameters is changed without invalidating this code. It's a forwards compatibility feature. And also to keep with that, one nice thing we typically want to do is fill our structure with zeros to begin with, so that we get, what tends to be typically valid defaults for most parameters. So we'll go ahead and fill this parameter with zeros to get rid of the garbage from the stack, and instead replace it with zeros. And since this operation is something we just are going to do all this time, this like mem clear, I'm going to go ahead and I'd love to define a function for it, but since in C++ you can't really write this function because this here is a real variable, but this is this weird kind of compiler, operation that the only way to do it in C++ is with a macro. So I'll go ahead and make a macro called memclear, takes a variable, and it puts it into this form. It puts the variable here so you can get the pointer, and here so we can get its size. And then go ahead and replace, get rid of the semicolon, go ahead and pass in our win class, and effectively these two lines are exactly the same thing. It's just simply replacing these entries with this, and the output should be this. So that new macro should clear our structure and fill it all with zeros. Now we just have to go through and fill in the parameters we actually want non-default values for. And to do that, we'll just read through the variables and choose which ones we want. The first one, CB size, and it says explicitly set this to size of WinClassEx. So we'll do exactly that. And the reason for this, again, is that forward compatibility, so that the RegisterClassEx function can look at this field and say, oh, you've passed in a structure of size 24. That must be this version of that structure. Okay, I'll do the right thing. Next is a style, and the Windows class styles are just, again, another set of flags, much like the CreateWindow flags. Turns out we don't need any of these at the moment, so we're just going to leave that as the default 0. The next field is this WinProc function pointer, and this is really important. In Windows, whenever the Windows operating system needs to communicate with your window, the way it does is through this WinProc. It is a function that takes a set of parameters, sometimes known message parameter and parameters of that message, and let your application know, hey, something's up, or hey, I want you to do something. So for example, when I click, on a button or something, I'll get the WM clicked message and with the parameter of the button ID. Eventually, we'll make a WinProc and overload its handlers to do things appropriate for our game. But to get started, we're going to start with a function that's already written called the default window proc. And that is a function written by Microsoft that does reasonable defaults when you pass messages to it. So for example, when you do this move, it actually goes ahead and moves the window and calls the function to paint the window in the new place, and so on and so forth. We'll start with the default and shortly overload it to more specific things, but the default will work for just fine. Next two fields specify extra bytes we could allocate with the class or with the window, and we don't really need any of those. Next one is the instance pointer, again passed in on the stack, so that should be just fine there. Next is an icon, for which null is totally fine and provides a default icon. That's cool. Next is a cursor, for which null says that the application will control the cursor. So we'll put in a real cursor here. Excuse me. And the way we make a cursor in Windows is the load cursor function. Go ahead and look that up. And the load cursor both loads cursors that you specify, but also system cursors. And we'll just use the system cursor. And to get a system cursor, we pass a null for the first parameter, and we'll choose the arrow cursor, but system cursor, and to get it to wrapped in the makeInt resource macro as it describes in the documentation here. Next is the background, and it says to set the background color to again, you could specify your own background brush, but we'll use a system brush. And again, to get that brush, we take the brush we want, just like a window brush, and it says you must add 1 to it, +1, and cast it to a brush. And that's probably because this enum included 0 and they wanted 0 to be the default or something like that. So that's probably what's going on there. It's a little ugly, but it's how it says it works. So we follow exactly what it says. Next is a menu, which we don't need. Next is a class name. From what we were doing earlier, we could, in this create window, we could either pass in this atom from the register class return value, or this class name that we're just going to make up and specify. And for our game, or for our uses, it totally makes sense to just use the atom since it's right there. If you were calling or trying to use a Windows class made by something else, or using a system one like edit or combo box or whatever, you would need to use the string rather than the atom because you didn't just create it right there. And then finally, small icon for which null uses default and is fine. So what we're doing, let's go over what we're doing again. We're taking, making a Windows ClassEx structure, clearing it, setting a set of params that we think we'll need, registering it, using that WinClass return value as the first parameter to create window, setting a bunch of other params, and then exiting the program. Let's compile and see what happens. Look at that. Seems like it mostly worked. Let's put some breakpoints and step through and see if what we did actually matches what we thought we did. We look at the class. We've cleared it by now, so it's full of zeros. We set a bunch of parameters. And again, looks pretty reasonable. We call RegisterClassEx. Get a valid atom back, pass it into the CreateWindow function, and we saw just for a second that window pop up, and then created a valid window, and now we exit the application. Pretty good. We've made our first window. In the next episode, we'll go over how to keep that window on screen for a little while and have it respond to the basic input from the mouse and so on when we set up the message queue. Thanks for watching.